China has responded to the exclusive story we brought you on this program yesterday, that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau requested a call with the Chinese premier, but that call was ignored, or the request was ignored. China's response: expect that to continue unless Canada releases Meng Wanzhou. The CBC's Katie Simpson is back on that story. She joins us now. Hi, Katie.
Hi.
So Meng Wanzhou, just to clarify for our viewers, that's of course the Huawei CFO, the big Chinese telecom giant CFO, who was detained, arrested in Canada on the request of American authorities back in December. What is Beijing saying today?
A reporter in Beijing at the Foreign Press office, or at the press briefing, asked a question about the CBC story, about whether there's a freeze in communications. Of course, as we reported yesterday, the Prime Minister tried to reach out to China's Premier Li Keqiang for a phone call in January to discuss the ongoing tensions, particularly around the expected death sentence that was given to Robert Schellenberg, a Canadian who's in a Chinese jail on drug crimes, as well as to demand the release of the two detained Canadians, Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor. The message that was received today, or that was delivered today by Beijing at that news conference, was that China, before China's going to reopen that line of communication, they want something specific. They want Meng Wanzhou released. And it was said in Chinese, and the translation is, we have part of that here. It says, "What I can tell you is the current setback Canada-China relations face is entirely caused by the Canada side itself, and the responsibility lies entirely with Canada too. We hope that Canada will take seriously our severe concerns and immediately release Ms. Meng Wanzhou and actively take a substantial measure to push the Canada-China relations back on track as soon as possible." In other words, if they want to reopen that line of communication and unfreeze those conversations, perhaps that's exactly what China wants to see. Now, Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister, has floated a similar idea. The story was first reported in the Globe and Mail, saying that he has been quietly suggesting that the best course of action here would be to release Meng Wanzhou, appease Beijing, and perhaps try to get other issues back on track there.
And so what is the government saying about that?
Chrystia Freeland was in Washington today for a series of meetings about Canada-China relations because, of course, Canada is trying to lean on the Americans for support in this, but also some trade and NAFTA-related meetings as well. But this was one of the first questions she was asked about at that news conference, and she was very quick to reject this suggestion that reportedly by the Globe and Mail came from Jean Chrétien.
It would be a very dangerous precedent indeed for Canada to alter its behavior when it comes to honoring an extradition treaty in response to external pressure.
Right now, the Canadian government is considering whether to ask Jean Chrétien to be a special envoy and send him to China to try to smooth things over. But the big question is now, if he's not on the same page as the foreign minister, is he going to be an effective communicator to the Chinese for Canada? So that adds a whole new layer of question here.
It does, whole new dimension. Thank you, Katie.
Thanks.
The CBC's Katie Simpson. So should Canada consider releasing Meng Wanzhou to end this diplomatic rift? It certainly would be unprecedented based on documents obtained by CBC News. This secret memo written to the Prime Minister shortly after Meng's arrest says, in yellow there are no examples of the Minister of Justice discharging a case for political or diplomatic reasons. Guy Saint-Jacques served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute and joins us from Montreal. Hi, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Nice to see you again.
Good afternoon. Good to see you.
Let's start with your reaction to the news that Mr. Chrétien reportedly was suggesting just outright canceling or dropping the extradition case against Meng Wanzhou. Good idea, bad idea? What do you think?
Well, first, I'm grateful for Mr. Chrétien volunteering to go to Beijing as a special envoy because he understands the magnitude of the crisis that we are now in. Now, with regard to going this route of abandoning the extradition process involving Mrs. Meng Wanzhou, I see four elements that have to be taken into account. The first, clearly, if the government were to go this route, this would be seen as intervening in a legal process. And what about rule of law in Canada? And what about caving into a superpower? So I think that there are some major risks with this, and for sure the opposition would jump on that. Second, what would be the reaction of Donald Trump? And Do we want to have a new round of tariffs? We know how prickly the president can be. So I think knowing that we have so much at stake with the US, I think this has to be an important element. The third point is the reputational risk with our partners. Let's remember that we have, the government has embarked on this campaign to try to seek support from other countries. And so if we were to cave in at this point, I think this would be badly perceived by others. And finally, the last point, if the government were to make this decision, and by the way, maybe if it had to be done, it should have been done right after Donald Trump had made comments that at that point we could have said this was political, but I think it's too late. But if the government were to make this decision now, I would suggest that it's the Prime Minister himself that communicate the news to the Chinese government, and then we would have to make sure that we have a real tight agreement to ensure that Canadians would be freed up and that China would stop all measures against Canada.
Minister Freeland said today it would be a very dangerous precedent for Canada to alter its behavior when it comes to honoring an extradition treaty in response to external pressure. That was her response to the suggestion reportedly from Mr. Chrétien.
Well, I have to say that I agree entirely with her. Canada is a country governed by the rule of law, and it's a question of deciding which crisis we want to manage. Do we want to manage a crisis with China, or do we want to manage a crisis with the U.S.? Because for sure we would have a crisis with the U.S.
How closely do you, I know you're in touch with obviously many people in China, how closely are they following the sort of back and forth that's going on in this country, the very public sort of debate around what the government should do, or even are they paying attention to the fact that the prospect of just dropping this case is even being raised?
Well, in a way, it's unfortunate that we are having this public debate, because it will comfort them in their view that if they apply enough pressure on the Canadian government, that at some point we'll just cry uncle and we will return Mrs. Meng. But I think we have here at stake some fundamental values about what is Canada all about. And, you know, of course, we don't have the same level of openness and transparency on the Chinese side. And so therefore, that's why I think this is an interesting idea that had to be debated, but at the same time, I don't think it's a realistic one.
Do you think there are any alternative mechanisms for the government to pursue? Is there anything else essentially that they could do to change this situation? We've had other people on the show saying this all comes down to Meng Wanzhou, and unless the case, proceeds and new things happen, it ultimately will still be stuck in this position.
Well, we run the risk of being stuck for years, because the extradition process of Mrs. Meng will take a long time. So I think at this stage, the only hope is still to put as much pressure as possible on the U.S. administration to try to help us out. And I'm glad to see that the Prime Minister will be going to meet with Donald Trump in Washington soon. And he has to really try to stiffen his spine, if this is possible, to talk very forcefully to Xi Jinping, assuming that the two will meet, Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi will meet at the G20 summit in Osaka. But even in that regard, I think the only short to medium term solution maybe could come or would come from a trade deal between China and the US that would involve in some fashion Huawei and resolve the issue. In the meantime, I think that Canada has to continue to work with partners, with other leaders who are going to attend the G20, to ask them to impress on the Chinese that they are damaging not only their relationship with Canada, but their image around the world.
We also know that the Prime Minister and Minister Freeland's requests for contact with their counterparts have gone basically ignored by the Chinese. In the meantime, while they are sort of talking with the U.S. and other allies to try and up the pressure, should they, as others have suggested, send someone like Mr. Chrétien, even given what he said, or some other sort of envoy to continue the conversation, or should they just be focusing their efforts on their allies?
Well, the problem with envoys is that so far what the Chinese have said is, we don't want to see anyone unless you promise to free up Mrs. Meng. And so I'm sure that if Mr. Chrétien were to go to China without a clear mandate, who knows, he would not be received. I don't expect that he would be received by a Chinese leader because they have been pretty blunt about what they expect. So I think that's why the government is stuck right now. The Chinese government doesn't want to discuss with any government official. They don't return calls. They don't want to see envoys. So I think we have to try to use other means. But also, I think that the government has to announce its own measures to show its own displeasure, and I would include in this tightening inspection on Chinese goods coming to Canada, going to WTO against China about what it has done on canola, and there are a number of other measures I think that we should do to impress on China that we are not going to take this lying down.
So the federal government should be looking at retaliatory measures. Is that how I should interpret what you said?
Yeah, and of course we have to do this in a reasonable way because China will want to retaliate. But you know, the rules under WTO allow us to do our own inspections to ensure the safety of Canadians. I think the government could announce that, as I've suggested previously, that we will no longer pursue the idea of a free trade agreement with China because the trust is gone, and you need trust to have such an agreement. It could announce also that it will redeploy resources that were devoted to China to other markets in China. I think also the government could do a review of Chinese investment in Canada to ensure that it does not go against national security. And so there are a number of measures that could take place like this to show that to China that we can also retaliate ourselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Really appreciate your time this evening. That's former Canadian Ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques.
Thank you.
I think when we reflect on it, it will be clear to all of us that it would be a very dangerous precedent indeed for Canada to alter its behavior when it comes to honoring an extradition treaty in response to external pressure. And I think when we think about the implications of setting such a precedent, we could easily find ourselves in a situation where, by acting in a single specific case, we could actually make all Canadians around the world less safe.
Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland dismissed the idea that Canada should drop the extradition case against Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in order to thaw the icy relations between Canada and China. The Globe and Mail is reporting sources say that former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien discussed that idea with business executives. Welcome back to Power and Politics and the Power Panel with David Attell, Melissa Lantzman, Andrew Thompson, and Marika Walsh. Marika, I'll start with you. So a lot of different political calculations going on here, but basically the report from the Globe and Mail said that Jean Chrétien was kind of floating this idea. I mean, he's not the first to talk about it, certainly, but the government kind of clamped that down pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that, Roland Paris, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former advisor on foreign policy, called Chrétien's comments profoundly unhelpful. And I think that speaks to how it affects how Trudeau is viewed, how it weakens his case. It's not just Jean Chrétien, it's also John McCallum, who again had these kind of comments around Meng Wanzhou that were out of step with the Liberal government. And so I think strategically, I think it hurts Trudeau as he tries to navigate this already very difficult situation.
Yeah, Andrew, I imagine it can't help to have this kind of very public debate waging. I mean, you got to think China's taking advantage of that.
Well, I think one of the problems with the attempt to try and exercise quiet diplomacy is it needs to be done quietly. And our diplomats seem to not be able to quite get that figured out right now. Having former Prime Minister Chrétien come out, although strategically that's certainly an option that the government must be looking at, is how to navigate around that. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's one of the conversations that's on the Prime Minister's agenda with President Trump for next week, is to really get a better sense of where the Americans are at on this. The problem is if you start floating it out, you actually narrow the ability for the Prime Minister to act on it, because they have to go back to the public statements, just as the Minister of Foreign Affairs said today, that this is all about the rule of law and it's about the process. The bottom line here is that we got played by Trump and the Americans, and there's nothing that says that by the time we extradite her to the U.S., that the Americans won't turn around and just release her, and we'll have worn this whole thing for really nothing. And I think that that's the real risk here, is that the Americans have tied this up into trade policy, not into anything else, and Trudeau really has, I think, run out of room to move. So it's a difficult spot to be in. Ideally, they would have dealt with it differently. Now they're probably right that it just has to play out.
Melissa, what do you think? I mean, and just to Andrew's point, the Prime Minister is headed to Washington next week to meet with President Trump at the White House.
Look, I agree with Andrew in the sense that diplomacy should be done behind closed doors, and I think there's a very big problem in the Liberal Party if the former Prime Minister is giving the current Prime Minister advice in the Globe and Mail. I think it very much limits his ability to do anything on this, but it all goes back to the Liberals not having a strategy, and I think that it desperately needs a reset, and unfortunately I think that reset is a change in government, because I actually don't think that he can do anything right now.
What would a change, I mean, what would the reset be though?
The reset would be an entirely new relationship with China, based on an actual strategy, without the detention of Canadians in the rearview mirror, without the exports on canola, and without, frankly, China walking all over us.
But the reset doesn't happen right away.
Has already said that they want.
Sorry, go ahead, Marika.
China's already said. I mean, you guys had this at the top of the show, that the reset is Meng Wanzhou's release. I haven't heard the Conservatives call for that.
Melissa.
No, and I suspect they wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think, David, I'll just bring you in. I mean, I think that this sort of underscores the difficulty in that successive governments have had in articulating a very specific policy towards China. It's like it starts one way and then it evolves into something else when they're confronted with the reality of the way the regime there works, which is a somewhat different reality now than it was during Mr. Chrétien's time.
Well, yes, it certainly is different. I mean, China has become bigger since Jean Chrétien's time. But Jean Chrétien, one of my favorite quotes from Jean Chrétien is, when you paint yourself into a corner, walk on the paint. And that's what Jean Chrétien is saying here. And you've had a former Canadian ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, on the program several times saying, this can only escalate. There's no real way out. And in terms of Chrystia Freeland's argument about protecting the safety of Canadians, well, there are two Canadians right now, let's not forget about them, the two Michaels, they're not safe right now. And so, and I'm not saying that we have to step on our principles, but this is a question of real politics here. And the Chrétien comment is actually maybe some sort of overture. I don't think it's just a clumsy comment that came, out of nothing. And so I'm wondering, with Jean Chrétien's wealth of experience with China, he has a very long list of contacts in China. He's, when he was Prime Minister and since. So I'm wondering if there isn't something there, because I know the Liberals don't want another Chinese bombshell, say, during the campaign. So
Isn't he kind of repeating what John McCallum said too?
Yeah.
Though? And I mean, John McCallum had to got.
But this was always Plan B. I'm convinced that this was the Liberals' Plan B, and the problem was John McCallum just got out in front of it. Rather than going and executing on it back in China and working this through, they ended up boxing themselves in again against this rule of law argument that they keep repeating like a mantra, which is good.
But
without
no
actually,
way they can do anything now after saying.
No, it's very, well, I agree. I think that's the real problem, is there's very little ability for this Prime Minister, because he's so compromised on the issue, to be able to find a way out of it.
Well, certainly
the best way probably is, I think the best way really now is to figure out with the Americans what the end game is on this, and how to get quickly to that.
Well, there's certainly nothing that a Prime Minister can do when he's getting advice from the Globe and Mail. Like, pick up the phone.
Well, he did meet with
and
Chrétien,
have a conversation.
He said, and Chrétien did release a statement, I think it was a week ago, saying that he was willing to travel. But anyway, interesting points. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.